$50 million. That's the bounty on a sitting president's head right now. The highest price tag ever placed on a world leader. 4,000 troops, nuclear submarines, warships positioned just miles from Venezuelan waters. The largest U.S. military buildup in the Caribbean since 1962. But here's what they're not telling you about this crisis, and what we discovered will change everything you think you know about what's really happening in Venezuela. Stay with me. This story has more twists than you can imagine. Right now, as you're watching this, American forces are surrounding Venezuela. The official reason? Fighting drug cartels. President Trump signed executive orders declaring Venezuelan gangs terrorist organizations. The Pentagon deployed guided missile destroyers. Marines are on standby for potential amphibious operations. But here's where it gets interesting. Venezuela sits on more oil than Saudi Arabia and Iraq combined. 300 billion barrels, the world's largest proven reserves. So is this really about drugs? Or is there something bigger at play? Let me walk you through what's actually happening. Because the story you're hearing in mainstream media, it's not the whole truth. But first, you need to understand how we got here. Because this crisis didn't start last month. It's been building for over 2 decades. 1999. Hugo Chavez wins Venezuela's presidency with a simple promise: take back the country's oil wealth from foreign companies and use it to help the poor. Sound familiar? It should. Because this exact scenario has played out across Latin America for decades. Chavez immediately starts renegotiating contracts with American oil companies. ExxonMobil, ConocoPhillips, Chevron, all forced to accept much smaller profit margins or leave entirely. By 2007, Venezuela is producing over 3 million barrels per day. Poverty drops dramatically. Literacy rates soar. Healthcare expands to rural areas for the first time in decades. But Washington isn't happy. Chavez is rallying other Latin American countries to reduce dependence on U.S. markets. He's selling oil to China and Russia. He's calling out American foreign policy on the world stage. Then, in 2015, the Obama administration declares Venezuela a national security threat and imposes the first sanctions. Not because of drugs, because of geopolitics. Question for you. If a country uses its own natural resources to help its own people, why would that threaten America's national security? The answer reveals everything about this current crisis. 2013. Chavez dies of cancer. Nicolas Maduro, his hand-picked successor, wins a narrow election victory. The opposition claims fraud. Protests erupt. Sound familiar? Here's where the story gets complicated. Because while Chavez was undeniably popular with Venezuela's poor majority, Maduro never had that same charisma or support. The economy starts struggling, not just because of sanctions, though those certainly made things worse, but because Venezuela had become too dependent on oil revenues. When oil prices crashed in 2014, the government couldn't afford its social programs anymore. Hyperinflation hits. Basic goods disappear from stores. Over 7 million Venezuelans, nearly a quarter of the population, flee to neighboring countries. It's one of the largest refugee crises in modern history. But here's what doesn't make sense about the official narrative. If Venezuela is this failed narco-state, why are countries like Colombia and Brazil actively cooperating with Venezuelan security forces on anti-drug operations? Why would Mexico's president publicly state that his government found no evidence of Venezuelan state involvement with drug cartels? Something doesn't add up here. Enter Tren de Aragua, the Venezuelan gang that supposedly justifies 4,000 American troops in the Caribbean. This organization started in 2014 inside Tocorón prison in central Venezuela. But calling it a typical prison would be misleading. Under Venezuela's system of allowing crime bosses called pranes to control certain facilities, Tocorón became something unprecedented. Inmates built a zoo, a nightclub, restaurants and bars, a playground, even a bank. The gang's leader, Héctor Guerrero, essentially ran a small city from behind bars. From this base, Tren de Aragua began expanding. They followed the massive Venezuelan migration crisis, setting up operations wherever desperate refugees settled. Colombia, Peru, Chile, eventually the United States. Their business model was brutal, but simple. Help Venezuelan women migrate, then force them into prostitution to pay off impossible debts, run extortion rackets against migrants who can't go to police, smuggle people, drugs, weapons. By 2023, U.S. authorities were linking the gang to murders in Florida, police shootings in New York, ATM thefts across multiple states. Real crimes, real victims, real problems. In September 2023, 11,000 Venezuelan security forces stormed Tocorón prison in what looked like a major crackdown. They destroyed the zoo, the nightclub, the whole criminal infrastructure. But here's the key detail everyone's ignoring. The gang's leadership escaped, and their international operations continued uninterrupted. If Maduro's government was really in partnership with this organization, why would they launch such a massive operation against their headquarters? It's a question no one in Washington wants to answer. Now let's talk about what the U.S. government is actually claiming. According to the Trump administration, Tren de Aragua isn't just a gang. It's part of a state-sponsored narco-terrorism enterprise run by President Maduro himself. The centerpiece of this allegation is something called Cartel de los Soles, the Cartel of the Suns, named after the sun insignias on Venezuelan military uniforms. The Treasury Department claims this organization is headed by Maduro and uses Venezuelan government institutions to traffic drugs. Justice Department officials say Maduro's associates have coordinated the shipment of 30 tons of cocaine to the U.S. They've frozen over $700 million in assets allegedly belonging to Maduro. The Drug Enforcement Administration claims Venezuela helps Colombian guerrillas provide record amounts of cocaine to Mexican cartels for U.S. distribution. On January 20th, President Trump signed an executive order designating Tren de Aragua as a foreign terrorist organization. Then he invoked the Alien Enemies Act, a law from 1798 previously used only during wartime, to justify mass deportations of Venezuelans. This is serious stuff. Terrorist designations, wartime laws, military deployments. But there's a problem with this narrative. A big problem. The two countries that would know best about Venezuelan drug trafficking, Colombia and Mexico, aren't backing up the U.S. claims. Colombia shares an 823-mile border with Venezuela. If anyone would know about state-sponsored drug trafficking, it would be Colombian authorities dealing with the consequences daily. But Colombia's president said something remarkable. His forces received significant support from Venezuelan security forces in border operations where they seized tons of drugs. That's the opposite of what you'd expect if Venezuela's government was actively promoting drug trafficking. Mexico's response was even more direct. President Sheinbaum stated, "We found no connection between the Sinaloa cartel and the Venezuelan state. We have no documents to support this." Think about that. Mexico is fighting a literal war against the Sinaloa cartel. They have every incentive to expose any foreign government supporting their enemies. Yet they're saying they found no evidence. Meanwhile, Venezuela has been providing counter-evidence. In 2025 alone, they claim to have seized over 52 tons of drugs, disabled more than 400 aircraft involved in trafficking, and dismantled numerous money laundering networks. Venezuelan officials have repeatedly offered to cooperate with the U.S. on counter-narcotics efforts. Interior Minister Cabello said, "If you want to prevent drugs from entering your country and eliminate cartels, here we are. We're ready for cooperation." The U.S. has ignored these offers. Here's another detail that should make you pause. When Venezuelan forces raided Tocorón prison, they didn't just arrest a few low-level criminals. They conducted a massive operation that destroyed Tren de Aragua's headquarters and forced leadership to flee. Why would a government in partnership with criminals destroy their own operation? Now let's zoom out and look at the bigger picture. Because this isn't really about a Venezuelan gang, is it? Venezuela controls the world's largest proven oil reserves, 304 billion barrels, more than Saudi Arabia and Iraq combined. But here's what's changed recently. As U.S. sanctions isolated Venezuela from Western markets, the country strengthened ties with America's biggest geopolitical rivals. China has invested over $60 billion in Venezuelan infrastructure and oil projects. Chinese companies are helping Venezuela modernize refineries and explore new fields. In return, Venezuela provides guaranteed oil supplies and a strategic foothold in America's backyard. Russia has been even more aggressive. Russian military advisors train Venezuelan forces. Russian companies manage Venezuelan gold mines. Russia sold Venezuela advanced missile defense systems and fighter jets. In 2019, Russia deployed nuclear-capable bombers to Venezuelan bases in a clear message to Washington. Russian naval vessels regularly conduct exercises in Caribbean waters alongside Venezuelan forces. This isn't about oil anymore. It's about spheres of influence in a new Cold War. From Washington's perspective, a government controlling the world's largest oil reserves, allied with China and Russia, located just off the American coast, represents an existential strategic threat. The drug trafficking allegations provide convenient justification for action that would otherwise look like naked imperialism. Consider the timing. These allegations intensified just as Venezuela was beginning economic recovery from years of hyperinflation and sanctions. Oil production was increasing. International observers noted improvements in governance. Venezuela was looking less like a failed state and more like a strategic competitor. But here's what really complicates this story. The human cost. Over 7 million Venezuelans have fled their country since 2015. This is one of the largest mass migrations in modern history. These aren't economic migrants looking for opportunities. They're people fleeing genuine hardship. Among 7 million refugees, inevitably some are criminals. When a quarter of your population leaves, you'll have bad actors mixed with genuine asylum seekers. Mathematical certainty. Tren de Aragua exploited this crisis brilliantly. They recruit desperate migrants with no legal status and limited options. They target the vulnerable, young women far from home, separated families, people who can't go to police. The gang has been linked to real crimes in America: sex trafficking in Nashville, armed robberies in New York, contract killings in Miami. These aren't made-up threats, but there's a difference between criminal opportunism and state-sponsored terrorism. U.S. intelligence reports acknowledge that Tren de Aragua operates independently of Venezuelan state control and lacks coordinated structure within the country. This contradicts the state sponsorship narrative. Moreover, the gang's victims are primarily other Venezuelans. If this were a state operation designed to harm America, wouldn't it make sense to target Americans rather than Venezuelan migrants? The pattern looks more like criminal exploitation of humanitarian crisis than coordinated attack on American national security. This isn't the first time drug allegations justified military intervention in Latin America. 1989. The U.S. invaded Panama to capture Manuel Noriega on drug charges. The real reason? Maintaining canal control during geopolitical transition. 2000s. Plan Colombia, a multi-billion-dollar military aid program ostensibly fighting drug cartels. The actual result? Strengthening Colombian military against leftist guerrillas threatening U.S. business interests. Recently, similar justifications for interventions in Afghanistan, where opium production increased under American occupation, and various African countries where counter-narcotics operations serve broader strategic purposes. There's a pattern. Drug trafficking allegations provide moral cover for actions motivated by geopolitical considerations. The current Venezuela case fits perfectly. A strategically important country with vast natural resources, aligned with American adversaries, facing allegations that justify military intervention. Even the timing follows historical precedent. These operations typically occur when target countries show stability signs that might make future intervention harder to justify. Venezuela's economy shows recovery signs. Inflation decreased dramatically. Oil production increases. International relations improve with several Latin American countries. Strategically, this might be America's last opportunity to act before Venezuela becomes too stable to justify intervention. As we speak, the largest military buildup in the Caribbean since the Cuban Missile Crisis continues growing. France announced increased surveillance in its Caribbean territory Guadeloupe, effectively joining the U.S. operation. This provides European legitimacy and additional operational bases. Venezuela responded by mobilizing civilian militias. Maduro claims 4.5 million people signed up to defend the country, though independent estimates suggest much lower numbers. 15,000 Venezuelan troops deployed to the Colombian border. Military exercises conducted nationwide. Anti-aircraft systems moved to coastal positions. Both sides prepare for conflict while publicly claiming they want to avoid it. Economic implications are already visible. Oil prices increased due to uncertainty about Venezuelan production. Regional stock markets declined. Caribbean tourism dropped as travelers worry about potential conflict. Most concerning is what this means for 7 million Venezuelan refugees throughout the region. They're caught between a U.S. government viewing them as potential security threats and a home country that may soon be at war. Countries like Colombia, Peru, and Brazil, which absorbed millions of Venezuelan migrants, face pressure to participate in U.S. operations or face consequences. This could destabilize the entire region. After weeks of investigation, several critical questions remain unanswered. If Venezuelan state involvement in drug trafficking is so clear, why won't Mexico and Colombia, the countries most affected, confirm U.S. allegations? If Tren de Aragua is truly a terrorist organization sponsored by Venezuelan government, why did Venezuelan forces destroy their headquarters and force leadership into exile? If this is really about stopping drug trafficking, why hasn't the U.S. accepted Venezuela's cooperation offers on counter-narcotics efforts? Why does military deployment look more like regime change preparation than counter-narcotics operations? Why are allegations escalating just as Venezuela's economy begins stabilizing? These questions don't have easy answers, suggesting the situation is more complicated than either side admits. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle. Tren de Aragua is a real criminal organization causing real harm, but the military response scale suggests this transcends law enforcement. Venezuela's government certainly made mistakes and may have ignored some criminal activities, but evidence for systematic state sponsorship of drug trafficking remains circumstantial. The United States has legitimate concerns about regional stability and drug trafficking. But the proposed solution, military intervention, could create more problems than it solves. So where does this leave us? We're watching a dangerous geopolitical chess game with real human consequences. Criminal organizations justify military actions. Humanitarian crises become weaponized for strategic advantage. Millions of innocent people caught in the middle. Venezuelan people who already suffered through economic collapse and mass migration face potential military intervention in their homeland. The broader Latin American region faces potential destabilization as great powers compete for influence. The international community faces questions about sovereignty, intervention, and modern use of force. What we know for certain, military confrontation won't solve underlying problems driving this crisis. Economic collapse, political polarization, and humanitarian emergencies require diplomatic solutions, not military ones. Drug trafficking problems are real, but they're symptoms of deeper issues: poverty, weak governance, lack of legitimate opportunities. These problems exist throughout Latin America and won't be solved by removing one government. Venezuelan refugee crisis won't be resolved by military action. If anything, intervention could create additional displacement waves and regional instability. Geopolitical competition between the United States, China, and Russia will continue regardless of what happens in Venezuela. But how it's conducted determines whether the region experiences prosperity or conflict in coming decades. As this situation develops, the question becomes, are we witnessing legitimate counter-terrorism operations or the opening moves of a much larger geopolitical confrontation? The answer will shape not just Venezuela's future, but the future of sovereignty and intervention in the 21st century. What do you think is really happening here? Are these genuine counter-narcotics operations, or something much bigger? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if this investigation opened your eyes to what's really happening in Venezuela, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Because stories like this, the ones that challenge official narratives and dig deeper than surface headlines, that's exactly what we're here to deliver. The truth is out there. You just have to know where to look.